The moment the final credits rolled, it wasn't just the end of a show. It was like a massive emotional crash landing for a whole culture. And honestly, the shrapnel is still flying everywhere.
It really is. And that's what we're diving into today.
We are digging into the source material that really defines this fallout. We're talking about the finale of a huge mainstream series where, I mean, years of this carefully analyzed subtext just abruptly crashed into a wall.
Yeah.
And it left a massive part of the audience, especially, the queer audience, feeling just profoundly betrayed, insulted even.
That phrase you use, crash landing, it's perfect. It completely captures the intense, almost unified reaction we found across all the material we're looking at today.
Which is pretty extensive.
Oh, totally. We've got video transcripts, viewer commentary stretching for miles, all these deep dive fan theories that one of our listeners sent in. And our mission today, it's pretty critical. We're not just, documenting disappointment.
No, it's more than that.
It's about extracting the most important insights from this event. Insights about queer representation, about what makes a story coherent, and I think most importantly, about the really complex, sometimes toxic power dynamics between creators and the people who love their work.
Okay, so let's unpack that immediate emotional pivot point, because the feeling wasn't just that the show failed to stick the landing.
Not at all.
The consensus, and our source material is just relentless on this, is that the creative team actively and intentionally misled their audience. People felt stupid. That's the word that comes up over and over.
So it's stupid for investing.
Exactly. For investing in what they believed was this subtle but really sincere queer representation, only to have the finale drop and conclude, pretty decisively that they'd been systematically queer-baited.
And what's so fascinating here, looking at the timeline of the reaction, is how quickly that sense of betrayal just solidified.
Yeah.
It wasn't a slow burn or a gradual realization over days.
Oh, it was instant.
It was cemented by these immediate symbolic failures that went way beyond just simple plot points. And the most commonly cited piece of evidence of what fans saw as outright, malice was the music.
The music. This is such a crucial detail because it speaks directly to the idea that the creators were, at the very least, aware of the fan conversation.
Yeah, it had to be.
We're talking about two iconic tracks here, David Bowie's Heroes and Prince's Purple Rain. Now, for so many people in the queer community, and specifically for the fans who are deeply invested in the Byler storyline, these songs are not just background noise.
No, they're anthems.
Yeah.
They're deeply ingrained cultural markers of queer identity, of struggle, of eventual triumph. They carry so much weight.
Let's talk about that context for a second. David Bowie, he's a quintessential gender-fluid icon.
Absolutely.
And Heroes is this incredibly powerful anthem of defiance, of finding strength in a love that's marginalized. That theme is it's so resonant with the hidden feelings between Will and Mike.
And Prince's Purple Rain, it's the same thing. It became this huge symbol for marginalized identities, people seeking escape and emotional truth. So the showrunners, by any reasonable standard, had to know the significance these specific songs held for the part of their audience that was analyzing the queer subtext.
And the sources point out that the show had even previously coded these songs specifically to that Byler dynamic.
Right, that's a cue point.
Commentators noted that for years, Byler fan videos had used these exact tracks to analyze the characters' connection. So to then take these established queer fan-specific anthems and deploy them in the finale.
But not for Will and Mike.
Not for them at all. But for these completely unrelated non-queer moments, including one particularly saccharine heterosexual kiss, well, fans saw that as nothing short of diabolical.
It really did feel like a deliberate provocation. Think about it. If the creators genuinely wanted to maintain this, impartial, non-coded narrative, they would have just avoided those tracks entirely.
Of course, they're too loaded.
They're way too loaded. So the choice to use them right at the climax to score the triumph of this straight canonical relationships after years of dropping hints, it was interpreted by our sources as this final intentional tease.
Like it was designed to maximize engagement right up until the very last second, only to just yank the rug out from under everyone.
Exactly. It showed either a deep misunderstanding of their audience's emotional literacy or, and this is what a lot of fans believe, something worse. A profound contempt for it.
And this brings us right to the epicenter of the whole storm. So let's turn the page here and really get into the specifics of what everyone is calling the Byler breakdown.
Right. The failure of what many felt was the core unrequited love arc of the entire series.
The whole thing.
Okay, so the Byler breakdown. The sources are, they are completely unified on this. The entire meltdown starts with the failure of the Byler story.
That's the potential romance between Mike Wheeler and Will Byers.
Right. And the failure was that it didn't get any kind of canonical resolved conclusion. But the issue here is that this relationship, for many, wasn't just some fun fan pairing. It felt narratively essential.
I think we really need to establish why fans felt it was so central. Let's go back to the beginning. Will's whole identity, his difference, his isolation, all of that stemmed from his implied queerness, his unique sensitivity.
And that was the driving force of season 1.
It was the entire driving force. He was the anchor. The emotional heart of that whole search was Mike's desperate love for his friend and that eventual connection to Will. So to deny that a resolution, fans argue, is to basically destroy the crucial point that justified all the trauma and all the buildup.
Absolutely. You just have to look at the structure of the show. We're introduced to this entire world with Will's disappearance, which is directly tied to his quote-unquote difference or sensitivity that the creatures from the Upside Down lack home to. Then in season 4, the sources all point to that one specific scene, the van scene, where Will, speaking, theoretically about Elle, delivers this profound confession to Mike about feeling different, feeling invisible, being terrified of rejection.
That van scene, it became one of the most highly analyzed scenes in recent television history. It really felt like the absolute peak of the tension. You have Will crying silently, expressing his deepest feelings for Mike, but he's doing it through this guise of discussing Elle's love for him.
And Mike?
Mike is just completely oblivious, self-absorbed. He misses the point entirely. So the audience naturally expected that scene to be the launching pad, the moment that would spark Mike's realization and lead to a conversation later.
But instead we got, virtually nothing.
Nothing, which leads us to this really critical piece of sort of inside information that the source commentary highlighted, the actor's intervention. This is maybe the most damning evidence the fans have against the creative team's intentions.
It's pretty significant.
So what exactly did Noah Schnapp, the actor who plays Will, have to say about all this? Because the material suggests he basically had to fight tooth and nail for even the bare minimum of emotional resolution for a character he'd been playing for nearly a decade.
The reports are pretty shocking. Schnapp, who is openly gay and clearly understood the massive emotional significance of Will's journey for the queer audience, he allegedly had to, and this is a quote, practically beg the writers for just one moment of closure.
Beg them?
Yes. He said he was terrified to even ask for a proper scene in episode 8 because he felt like he was stepping out of place or asking for something that was outside the writer's vision.
Wow. So a core actor, someone who is deeply invested in the truth of his character, felt genuine fear about just requesting a conversation about his character's massive, seasons-long emotional arc. That says a lot about the creative environment.
It really does. And the result of his insistence. It was that short, profoundly unsatisfying best friend conversation at the radio tower.
The one that resolved nothing.
Exactly. And even then, Schnapp reportedly got a limited response from the writers. They basically told him he got one scene, and any further suggestions he had for a deeper resolution were just shut down.
So if the actor who embodied this central character had to fight that hard just for a few lines of awkward dialogue that basically just reaffirms their best friends, it really suggests the writers were actively resistant to providing any kind of substantial queer resolution.
The narrative implication here is it's staggering. It's that the writers, if they were left completely to their own devices, might have just let Will's feelings vanish into the ether.
With no acknowledgement at all.
None whatsoever. And this resistance, it fundamentally undermined Will's entire journey. It reduced what should have been this pivotal moment of emotional reckoning into a trivial, quickly resolved footnote.
And this resistance, it ties directly into what fans are calling the destruction of Mike's character arc. For years, the leading fan theory was that Mike's persistent inability to say, "I love you" to Elle, and his emotional turmoil and his, occasional dismissiveness toward Will, that it was all rooted in repressed queerness, a deep-seated, internalized homophobia that made him push away the emotional vulnerability that Will represented.
And that theory made a lot of sense narratively. It created a complex character who was struggling with his identity in a really restrictive 1980s environment. It gave him depth.
But the finale, according to the sources, just completely eliminated this complexity. It just flattened it, leaving a far more well, a far more devastating conclusion.
Yeah, the interpretation just shifted. It went from Mike being this deeply conflicted, closeted character to him simply being a bad boyfriend who lacked empathy.
So his inability to express love wasn't a symptom of some deep emotional repression tied to his identity.
No, it was just a sign that he was immature.
Yeah.
That he was fundamentally insensitive and maybe didn't really care about Elle as much as the story wanted us to believe he did. His character development just completely flatlined.
And the resulting fan interpretation of Mike's final fate is, ironically, seen as maybe even more tragic than Will's.
I've seen a lot of that, yeah.
Because if Will eventually gets to escape Hawkins and find some form of acceptance, Mike is perceived as the one who gets left behind. A man who is, in fan analysis, super, super gay, but is now doomed to rot in the closet forever in his hometown.
It's the ultimate narrative cruelty, isn't it?
Yeah.
He's stuck in this perpetual state of denial. He's feeling guilty for forcing himself to love Elle, and he's probably going to spend the rest of his life wondering if he missed his shot with Will.
It's the tragedy of conformity winning. One of the sources provided this just searing comparison, arguing that Mike's imagined adult future is doomed to look exactly like Ted Wheeler.
His dad. Oh, that's brutal.
It's brutal. Mike's inert, repressed, suburban, mediocrity-defining father, that's his future.
That comparison is incredibly potent because Ted Wheeler represents a lifetime of stagnation and emotional denial. He's the antithesis of the adventurous, passionate paladin that Mike started out as.
And for the queer audience who saw their own struggles reflected in Mike's repression, that trajectory is genuinely horrifying. The idea that the reward for his entire journey is just becoming his dad.
And this character assassination, it wasn't even subtle. It was reinforced by the sheer volume of unaddressed plot holes and symbols that the Byler fans have been relying on for years as evidence of intentional subtext.
Right. And now those omissions, they serve as proof of intentional baiting.
Exactly.
Okay, let's dedicate some real time to the centerpiece of this symbolic betrayal. We have to talk about the painting saga. This requires a deep dive into the context because that painting is so much more than just a prop.
Absolutely. The painting was, it was the entire visual manifestation of Will's confession. So back in season 4, Will presents Mike with this elaborate painting, and he claims that Elle commissioned it to prove her love.
And the painting itself depicts the 4 core boys: Will, Lucas, Dustin, and Mike standing together fighting a dragon, with Mike at the very center, leading the charge as the paladin, the hero.
But the absolute key lies in the words Will uses while he's explaining the painting to Mike and the van. He doesn't just describe a battle scene.
No.
He describes Mike as the heart of the group, the person who holds them all together, and that without him, they would just fall apart. And this speech, which he gives while visibly holding back tears, is interpreted by fans as Will expressing his own love for Mike, his need for Mike, his fear of losing that connection.
And the ultimate betrayal of that moment is that Mike completely accepts this explanation at face value, that it's from Elle. He never once questions the profound, tearful sincerity of Will's speech.
He just takes it.
He just takes it. Now, fast forward to the epilogue. The sources noted with a lot of anger that Mike still has the painting hanging prominently on his wall. Presumably, he still believes it's from Elle.
Which highlights his fundamental lack of comprehension or emotional growth across the entire final season. It's staggering.
If he had genuinely processed Will's confession in the van, which, by the way, the writers themselves confirmed was Will's declaration of love, that painting should have become a deeply complex, maybe even painful symbol for Mike.
He should have had some kind of reaction to it, addressed it, maybe taken it down, or at the very least realized the lie he was told.
But it just hangs there, a glaring, unresolved symbol of Will's unrequited love and Mike's enduring ignorance. It's a testament to the total lack of narrative follow-through.
The sources really argue that this omission alone proves the writers prioritized just moving the plot to a predetermined, straight, conformist ending. They just didn't have time to deal with the messy reality of the painting and the lie Mike was living under.
And the list of these queer subtext clues that fans felt betrayed by, it goes so much further than just the painting. There's Mike's established difficulty in saying, "I love you" back to Elle.
An inability that lasted multiple seasons.
Multiple seasons. And when he finally does, its ultimate resolution just felt completely forced.
And we also have the observation about Finn Wolfhard's physical acting, the actor playing Mike.
Yes, tell us about that.
Well, Byler fans noted a really significant contrast between Volume 1 of the final season, where his interactions with Will were observed as being physically touchy or engaged, and then Volume 2.
What happened in Volume 2?
He noticeably began pulling away, acting awkward during any moments of proximity with Will.
And fans theorized this was a direct, visible reaction to an intentional script change.
Exactly. Possibly related to the Divorce-Gate theory, which we'll get into later.
Yeah.
It really seemed like the actor was given a directive to physically distance himself from Will, signaling this huge narrative shift away from the queer subtext that had been building for years.
And then there's maybe the most final, most blatant piece of intentional subtext, placed right in the epilogue to, I guess, maximize the ambiguity. The lingering shot of Mike's and Will's D&D binders.
Oh, right. They're placed side by side, touching. And they're labeled in blue and yellow.
The universally accepted Byler color coding.
So even in the absolute final moments of the show, after the emotional resolution was supposed to be set in stone, the production team, or someone involved, made sure to include a visual suggestion of their enduring, close, and potentially romantic bond.
Fans argue this is not an accident. There's no way. It's deliberate ambiguity designed to keep that investment alive, to allow the ship to sink slowly, ensuring maximum audience pain and continued engagement.
It creates this powerful conclusion in the source material we looked at. The fans were not delusional, as some critics claim they were.
No.
The writing was just cowardly. They planted all the crumbs, they maintained all the visual suggestions, they accepted the emotional investment from the fans, but they refused to deliver the meal, out of what fans perceived as either fear or just disdain for canonical queer joy.
But the failures didn't just stop with Mike and Will. I mean, when we look at the epilogue as a whole, our sources suggest the writers demonstrated a pretty fundamental disdain for queer characters across the board.
Yeah, that's a fair assessment.
So let's pivot now to the widely, and I mean widely, rejected ending that was given to Will Byers.
Will's epilogue ending is, it's analyzed as a masterclass in applying what fans call stupid tropes. The show sends him moving away to a major city, and he's eventually seen finding a love interest in a gay bar.
And this immediately drew just heavy, heavy criticism, because it perpetuates this old, tired idea that gay people have to leave their homes and their families, their core relationships, to find acceptance.
And not just that, but that queer life primarily exists within nightlife settings.
That is a point worth dwelling on, because this trope suggests that, wholesomeness and domesticity are reserved for the heterosexual characters.
Right.
While queer characters have to find their salvation in the anonymity and, frankly, the potentially chaotic atmosphere of a city bar. And fans argue this is just profoundly contradictory to Will's established character identity.
Exactly. Will Byers is not a party animal. No. He's not. He is consistently portrayed as a socially anxious, sensitive artist. He's carrying significant trauma from his abusive, alcoholic father.
Which would make any setting involving alcohol, loud noise, or large groups of strangers deeply uncomfortable for him.
Deeply. So the idea of him finally finding happiness while, quote, thriving in a sweaty gay bar, potentially drinking underage with some random, possibly older love interest, it felt fundamentally miscalculated, just completely out of character.
The sources drew this really powerful contrast, didn't they? Between the stereotypical ending and the ending the character truly deserved. Fans didn't want the drama. They wanted the emotional truth of who Will was.
They wanted a wholesome conclusion.
Yeah.
Something that fit his artistic and romantic nature. The desired alternative, and this was described in so many of the sources, was a quiet, beautiful, domestic moment.
Like what?
Like Will painting a magnificent place, finally expressing his internal world visually, and his love interest is there, bringing him a coffee or simply kissing him on the cheek as he worked. Just a scene of quiet, earned joy.
This emphasizes such a crucial point about representation, Queer joy doesn't have to be loud or hypersexualized to be authentic.
It has to fit the character.
It has to fit the character's internal landscape. For an anxious artist like Will, stability, domesticity, and quiet acceptance were the true emotional goals. Not some noisy bar scene that basically mirrored the chaos he spent the entire series trying to escape.
And to add another layer of tragedy to it, the final trajectory of Will's character is interpreted as the very fate his greatest enemy, Vecna, used against him.
I hadn't even thought of that.
Will spent the entire series trying desperately to hold on to his friends, his family unit. He's traumatized by loss and separation. So his ending being alone, separated from Mike, Lucas, Dustin, and Elle in a distant city, is effectively his greatest fear.
That is a staggering implication. Vecna literally used Will's deep-seated fear of isolation and being different as a weapon against him. And by having the narrative ultimately isolate Will Geographically and emotionally, the show delivers the character's worst nightmare under the guise of an optimistic conclusion.
And if you look at the entire core group, Will is the only one who is entirely separated from his close circle.
You're right.
Which just reinforces the idea that his difference, his queerness, is precisely why he cannot have the stable, idyllic ending that's afforded to his straight friends, who mostly get to remain intertwined in Hawkins.
He's rejected romantically, and then he's literally distanced from the people he loves most. It's seen as this cruel narrative punishment for his identity.
And this pattern of failing queer characters, it just continued with the second major representation failure of the epilogue, the story of Robin Buckley and Vickie, often shipped as Vickie.
Right. So what happened there?
This failure involves the writers imposing this overly realistic standard, but only when it serves to deny queer joy.
What do you mean?
Throughout the season, the relationship between Robin and Vickie was being carefully built up. Fans were expecting a canonical moment, a romantic payoff. Perhaps it would culminate in that fancy date at Enzo's that was repeatedly teased.
But the epilogue offered nothing of the sort. The sources noted that Robin and Vickie's eventual breakup happened entirely off-screen.
Off-screen.
Gone it. The audience was simply told they were no longer together.
And the writers reported justification for this decision, that most couples don't stay together after high school, is seen by fans as pure narrative cowardice.
Because why apply that mundane statistical realism only to the lesbians?
Exactly. When you consider the sheer number of narrative improbabilities the show embraces, interdimensional monsters, children constantly surviving mortal peril, a high schooler saving the world applying brutal high school relationship statistics exclusively to the queer pairing, is just a glaring double standard.
It raises that crucial question. Why is the risk of alienating a conservative or mainstream audience always placed solely on the backs of queer storylines? The showrunners had no trouble creating these lifelong pairings for their straight characters, but the burgeoning lesbian romance has to conform to the brutal off-screen reality of high school stats.
Or just vanish.
And the critique also extended to the treatment of other marginalized characters. Fans lamented the creation of Vanishing Vickie and the use of female and POC characters like Kali or 8 from a previous season.
I remember her. They're introduced with significant emotional power or plot potential, only to be tragically discarded or sidelined once their utility as a plot device is exhausted. This pattern suggests a willingness to use queer and marginalized characters to generate interest, but without any genuine commitment to their sustained development or joy.
Okay, so finally, we have to analyze the canonical couple that the writers did choose to champion. Mike and Elle, or Mylevin. Even the fans who weren't invested in Byler struggled to accept this final pairing, given all the narrative decisions leading up to it.
The general consensus across our sources is that Mike and Elle's relationship just felt boring and bleak throughout the entire season. There was a profound lack of chemistry, of genuine romantic moments, or any kind of mutual understanding that felt earned.
And Mike's continuous struggle to express love, which dominated the emotional landscape of the season, was never resolved in a convincing way.
Which made their final romantic scene in the epilogue feel completely unbelievable and, for a lot of people, just hard to watch. It felt rushed and pasted on the characters who had spent the last 2 seasons feeling distant and disconnected.
And the climax of this narrative failure was Elle's monologue. In that scene, Elle claims Mike understands her better than anyone else, that he's her true connection to the world.
A statement the audience found deeply unbelievable, even absurd. Given Mike's actions throughout the season, he was emotionally distant, absent, frequently insensitive. He was struggling to offer even basic support or comprehension of Elle's immense trauma.
The failure is just compounded when you think about who should have received that emotional payoff. Many critics argue that the true emotional weight of the finale should have been with Hopper.
Her dad.
Her adoptive father. The one who genuinely understood her trauma, her sacrifice, and her unique struggles with isolation and power.
So by prioritizing this strained, unearned romantic moment with Mike over a powerful, deserved father-daughter reunion, the writers just completely missed the mark on emotional resonance. The plot explicitly required Elle to sacrifice everything to essentially become as good as dead and alone after confronting the villain.
Which gave viewers an existential crisis because it just felt like such a cruelly solitary fate.
The source commentary concluded that if the writers were so intent on making 11 the canonical ship, they didn't even commit to writing it believably. They spent more time tearing the relationship down than building it up, which just made the final resolution feel hollow and forced. So moving into our third section, we see how this accumulation of emotional betrayal and just glaring narrative errors, it led fans not just to critique the writing, but to start developing these intricate meta-theories to try and explain the catastrophic decline in quality.
Right, because it just didn't make sense. So let's start with the narrative core that was hollowed out. The Will Byers plot drain. Will, who was once the central driving force, the linchpin connecting the human world to the Upside Down, was essentially rendered irrelevant in the final act.
It's unbelievable when you think about it.
Yeah.
Despite years of his character being defined by his enduring connection to Vecna and the hive mind, this psychic link that put him, and by extension the whole party, in constant danger, there was virtually no payoff in the final battle.
The expectations were immense, weren't they? Fans expected Will to play this pivotal, maybe even near-death role.
Of course. Perhaps his connection would allow him to locate Vecna, or maybe he'd be the one to save Mike in a moment of emotional clarity, risking himself because of his unique bond with the entity.
But nothing happened.
Nothing. His connection it vanished when it was most dramatically needed.
And this is more than just a missed opportunity. It signals a fundamental carelessness with the character's established lore. This lack of payoff joins a long, long list of demonstrable fundamental plot holes that show the writer's waning regard for their own canon.
It's pretty bad.
Can we list some of those core details the sources cited? The ones that were just carelessly discarded? Because this list, it really demonstrates an astonishing lack of commitment to the details of their own central characters.
Certainly, a major one. Vecna's personalized vision for Will, which was promised when Vecna targeted him, was never shown.
Right. We saw the personalized psychological attacks on Max, on Chrissy, on Fred. Those scenes were crucial to the season 4 narrative.
Crucial. And Will was supposedly a central target because of his connection, yet his specific psychological trauma was never revealed. That robs the audience of closure regarding his deepest fears.
Then there's the detail about his birthday.
Yes. Will's birthday is established as March 22nd. It's a detail made canonically important early in the series. Yet, in Season 4, that birthday was forgotten. It was entirely unacknowledged by his friends. A small detail that felt like a massive character slight.
And then it got worse.
It did. In the subsequent season, Joyce, his own mother, misstated Will's age when he was taken. She confused his history. And these aren't minor continuity errors. They are foundational mistakes regarding a character whose entire narrative function was defined by his age, his disappearance, and his trauma.
It really suggests the writers essentially just lost interest in Will Byers as a character and relegated him to a plot accessory. This perceived incompetence has been directly leveraged by fans to explain the emotional betrayal.
Which leads us directly to the public perception of the writers themselves.
And the source material here indicates just widespread fury over the writer's alleged post-finale comments. Specifically, there were reports that they referred to the Byler fandom, and by extension, the entire queer audience, as noise.
Noise that they had to block out to write their story.
And here's where it gets really interesting, because the perceived insult is twofold. First, it just dismisses years of dedicated intellectual engagement and analysis of the show's own subtext.
Right. The audience wasn't just inventing the queer coding, they were analyzing what was presented to them.
And second, and this is maybe more damaging, this comment was interpreted by fans as validation for the homophobic segment of the audience, the people who had been ridiculing Byler shippers as delusional for years.
It made the writers appear cruel, indifferent, and aligns with the segment of the audience that sought to deny the possibility of queer relationships entirely. By claiming that this huge emotional investment was merely noise, they essentially licensed the dismissal of queer identity within the fandom.
And this pervasive sense of writer indifference and narrative decay led to the rapid rise of these really elaborate meta-theories, all aimed at finding a non-betraying explanation for the quality drop.
The first major theory is Divorce-Gate.
Divorce-Gate, okay?
Divorce-Gate is the ultimate effort to explain the sudden, dramatic shift away from queer-coded plots that happened between Volume 1 and Volume 2 of the final season. And it hinges on the public knowledge of one of the showrunners' divorce from his wife, Leigh Janiak.
And we need to give some background on Leigh Janiak here, because her identity is absolutely central to this theory. She's a successful director and writer, and she's notably known for the Fear Street trilogy,
which was a massive hit with young audiences and featured overt, positive, and deeply central queer representation.
Exactly.
So the theory posits that Janiak was the secret creative mastermind behind the show's best parts, or at least the major uncredited ghostwriter, especially for the queer-coded storylines and the deep emotional connections that fans loved.
The sources suggest she may have been instrumental in writing or guiding the complex subtext of Will's arc, Mike's repression, and the development of Robin and Vickie.
And the timeline is the key to the theory's persuasive power. Volume 1 of the final season, which contained the peak of the Byler subtext, that van confession, and the setup for Vickie, that was all filmed and completed before the divorce.
So the theory suggests that after she left, the subsequent scripts for Volume 2, the ones that delivered the non-resolution, the pulling away, the off-screen breakup, were intentionally changed by the remaining creative leads.
Fans attribute the sudden loss of narrative quality and the decisive abandonment of queer narratives directly to her absence. The narrative, in this theory, became the work of two sad, lonely, cis, straight white men who prioritized conforming to mainstream expectations and commercial safety over honoring the complex queer narratives that Janiak had allegedly initiated.
It's a way for fans to preserve their love for the show's early genius, really, by placing the blame for the later failure on a specific external event rather than accepting that the original creators might have just intentionally betrayed them.
And if that wasn't enough narrative gymnastics to explain the betrayal, we arrive at the absolute peak of fan desperation and denial. Conformity-Gate.
Conformity-Gate. This one essentially posits that the ending we all saw wasn't real. Can you walk us through the logic behind believing the entire finale was just an illusion?
This theory springs from the idea that the ending just felt profoundly off. It was too weakly written, too aggressively fitting into the norm, and just way too predictable. So the core tenet is that the ending must be an illusion. A staged, predictable nightmare perpetrated by a villain, maybe Vecna, maybe the Mind Flayer.
A Vecna fanfic, as they call it.
Exactly, designed to break the heroes by forcing them into these mundane, conforming, and ultimately miserable lives.
So all the failures, Will being isolated in a city, Mike stuck in repression, Robin's relationship vanishing, Elle's character becoming solely defined by a lukewarm boyfriend, are actually intentional plot signals that this happy suburban resolution is completely fake.
Precisely. And the evidence fans use to support this theory is fascinating. They point to all the plot holes we've already discussed, the out-of-character behavior, and the return of a specific musical cue. David Bowie's Heroes.
And this loops back beautifully to our introduction. Why is Heroes the key clue here?
Fans meticulously track the usage of Heroes throughout the entire series, and they noted that the song had previously played during 2 instances of fake or temporary death in the show.
When?
First, when Will's body was found in season 1, which was later revealed to be a decoy, and second, when Hopper's letter was read after he was presumed dead in season 3, only for him to be revealed as alive.
So its use in the final dark epilogue, which saw Elle essentially die by sacrificing her power, Will accepting loneliness, and Mike accepting repression, could be interpreted as a symbolic clue. A clue that this outcome, too, is temporary or fake.
It's a signpost, intentionally left by a clever writer, or perhaps Janiak's ghost, that this ending is merely a staged reality, waiting for the true ending to be revealed later, maybe on a specific symbolic date.
It says a lot, doesn't it? When a significant portion of your audience has to believe your entire final act was a lie perpetrated by the villain just to maintain faith in your competence or your moral commitment as storytellers.
It really underscores the depth of the betrayal.
Yeah.
The non-canonical explanation felt more emotionally truthful than the canonical one.
So we've navigated the rapid, horrible waters of this finale. We've charted the betrayal of queer narratives and the resulting narrative incompetence. The disappointment is profound. The narrative ship has definitively wrecked in the mainstream media ocean. But the main emotional takeaway from the sources isn't resignation. It's this massive surge of inspiration.
That's the most empowering finding from this entire deep dive. The failure of the mainstream show has galvanized this audience. They're refusing to let the canon betrayal define the characters they loved, and they're realizing emphatically that they are better writers.
They're taking matters into their own hands.
Completely. And their lifeboats are heading straight for what they're calling the New Islands of Hope. We're talking about the mass migration of fans to platforms like Archive of Our Own or AO3 Island.
And this isn't just venting, is it?
No, it's an active, collective process of self-authorship. They're writing fix-it fan fiction, new screenplays, original queer media that honors the emotional truth that the show just discarded.
The sources cite a specific Byler fanfic, "You Took My Heart, I Was Sleeping Beautifully," which became one of the most popular fanfics of all time just months after it came out.
Which demonstrates the massive, untapped demand for the story the creators were either too timid or too biased to tell. This demand wasn't a niche. It was a hungry mainstream audience craving emotional resolution and canonical queer joy.
The lesson here seems pretty clear. Representation doesn't wait for corporate permission anymore. When a mainstream show fails this spectacularly, it doesn't kill the story. It fuels the queer media renaissance by shifting the creation to platforms where the audience is the author.
And we are seeing positive counterexamples that prove the writer's alleged argument about the necessity of realism and conformity is just. It's baseless. The sources repeatedly cite the positive reception of the show Heated Rivalry, and notably, the Fear Street trilogy.
Which ironically links right back to the Divorcegate theory, since it was directed by Lee Janiak.
And these works are thriving commercial and critical successes. These counterexamples serve as evidence that demand, quality, and powerful representation exist and succeed when the stories are created by genuine voices who prioritize emotional truth and character integrity over maximizing profit or catering to the lowest common denominator.
And this brings us back, just one last time, to the most tragic figure in this final analysis, Mike Wheeler. We're left with this lingering image of a boy who started with so much promise and ended in enforced conformity.
Because if Will moves on, finds a life, and accepts himself, Mike is the one left behind in Hawkins, forced into a straight existence he never wanted, perpetually yearning.
So the ultimate question for the audience remains unresolved. Is Mike truly happy? Or is he stuck in a depressing state of repression, staring at Will's painting every single day, feeling guilty for not loving Elle, and forever believing he missed his shot with Will?
The canonical ending suggests a deeply sad outcome, where conformity wins entirely, sacrificing one core character's emotional complexity just to maintain the status quo.
So the challenge for you, the listener, as you reflect on this entire creative catastrophe is this. If the creators have destroyed the canon and sentenced Mike to lifelong repression, is the ultimate act of queer defiance just abandoning the toxic canon entirely? Is the true path forward prioritizing the real life and the self-created joy found on AO3 Island, proving that the true story doesn't end when the credits roll, but starts when the audience begins to write their own endings?
The disappointment surrounding the Stranger Things finale wasn't just about, simple narrative loose ends. For a lot of viewers, it felt much more like a calculated betrayal, especially after years of really meticulously laid subtext.
Welcome to the debate. Our discussion today is focused squarely on that controversial conclusion of the final season, and we're drawing on the widespread audience critique about how several key character and plot arcs were handled.
Right. And the central question we really have to get into is this. Was the failure of the finale primarily due to a calculated, almost commercially motivated queerbaiting that was designed to maximize audience engagement?
Or was it just generalized narrative incompetence, a kind of systemic creative failure where the writing team simply lost its grip on everything, really? Character continuity, plot logic, across the board. I'll be arguing that the sheer breadth of the poor execution points to that overarching creative failure, one that isn't just about queer themes.
And I'm going to argue that the intentional use of queer coding, followed by that absolute refusal to offer resolution, points directly toward a kind of profitable deception.
Okay.
So for me, it's the intentionality that's key. We saw this really visible signaling, not just in the show, but in promotional materials too, around the Mike and Will dynamic, Byler as it's known, and also the constant hinting at a resolution for Robin and Vickie.
This signaling was definitely there, I won't argue with that. But was it malicious or just sloppy?
I think it was deliberate. I mean, the most compelling evidence for me is the layered imagery around Mike's character. There was so much deliberate queer coding, that pervasive closet imagery. You had a literal one-way sign pointing to a closet. You had the destruction of his actual childhood closet. I mean, come on, that's not just accidental set dressing. It reinforces this whole narrative idea that Mike is repressed, that he's fighting his true self.
I'll concede that imagery exists, and it's definitely potent in the history of queer narratives. But to pivot to my position here, while those specific arcs definitely suffered, The narrative flaws are so universal, they're so pervasive, that they really suggest a fundamental breakdown in just basic writing competence that affected every single character. The writers abandoned these huge, essential plot lines that had absolutely nothing to do with queer themes.
Such as?
Well, take Will's connection to Vecna and the hive mind. His link to the Upside Down was set up to be central to the entire mythology of the show. But in the end, it gave us what? No payoff. Absolutely no payoff. They completely ignored the fact that Will's origin story, the Upside Down being frozen on November 6th, was never explained. And I mean, even the simplest canonical details were just dropped. Will's birthday and his age were misstated multiple times. That's not calculated deception. That is just a failure to track continuity. It's a classic sign of an overwhelmed and frankly incompetent writer's room.
Okay, forgetting a birthday is careless, I'll give you that. But failing to resolve Will's entire emotional core, which was so clearly tied up in his feelings for Mike, I mean, that's a far greater betrayal to a character than ignoring some of Vecna's lore.
But the betrayal extended far beyond just Byler. I mean, look at how they treated other characters. Holly, a character of color, was introduced given this profound trauma, and then, I think by audience consensus, was only brought back just to kill her in this brutally isolated subplot. Her death had no emotional weight for the main cast. It was just a device. That's a failure to treat a character like a human being, not queerbaiting.
But the specific arcs that required the writers to commit to a non-heteronormative reality, those received an extra layer of what I would call defensive negligence. The worst example being that realism cop-out for Robin and Vickie breaking up with the excuse that, oh, most high school couples don't last.
And that is perfect evidence for incompetence. That justification is intellectually bankrupt in a show that features interdimensional horror and psychic powers. I mean, a selective application of realism only to the queer relationship just exposes a complete lack of intellectual rigor. They didn't know how to write a happy queer ending, so they just retreated to this lazy, totally incongruous excuse.
Okay, let's move right to the core of it then. Mike's characterization, you argue his failures were just him being a bad boyfriend to Elle.
Yes, precisely. It reads as a symptom of systemic writing failure. His inability to say, I love you, the general lack of chemistry in their relationship, it just reads like the writers were tired of their main male protagonist. Instead of showing the agony of repression, which would be an interesting story, they just made him a terrible partner. His emotional absence felt, frankly, unbelievable, even when Elle's life was on the line.
Right, I see why you think that. But let me offer a different perspective on that emotional absence. That lack of connection is the repressed character arc. It's what was baited. It was designed to keep the queer audience watching for a release that they knew was never going to come. The narrative they built wasn't about him being a bad boyfriend in some generic sense. It was about the profound cost of being an emotionally inaccessible, deeply conflicted young man.
But why would a calculated betrayal make the main character so flat, so uninteresting?
Because the subtextual narrative was one of tragic queer coding. This is a powerful literary tradition where unfulfilled queer characters are punished or they're left alone because they can't act on their true identity. Mike's future, where he's basically turning into his emotionally vacant father, Ted Wheeler, ending up alone, it's the textbook embodiment of this tragedy. His dull relationship with Elle only reinforced the idea he was on the wrong path, and it kept dangling the Byler resolution as the true, vibrant alternative.
That's a compelling analysis of the result, I'll grant you. But I still see it differently. Mike's pain could just as easily be interpreted as guilt over failing Alcen, not irrefutable proof of repression. It's ambiguous because the writers failed to commit to any clear internal conflict for him. If they were going for deliberate tragic coding, it was so poorly done that it just came across as a protagonist with no personality.
A risk they were willing to take, apparently. Now let's look at Will's epilogue ending, which for me just solidifies the tokenism. Will is this introverted, artistic, deeply sensitive kid, and yet his happy ending is finding some guy in a big city gay bar.
I agree. That scene was woefully inappropriate for his character.
I'd call it a stupid trope. It's the most generic, cosmopolitan gay ending you could write. It completely denies him the wholesome, tailored, romantic resolution he actually deserved. You know, maybe meeting someone while he was painting, something that felt true to him. Instead, the writers just offered this stereotypical gesture to try and silence criticism. It's a complete failure to respect the character they built, and it proves they only cared about checking a box.
And this is where malice and incompetence really intersect. But I lean heavily towards incompetence because of how profoundly insensitive that scene was. Placing this vulnerable, socially anxious artist, Will, in a gay bar in a huge city, drinking underage, during the height of the AIDS epidemic. I mean, it showed not just a lack of care for his character, but a massive failure of basic social and historical awareness.
It was certainly tone deaf.
And given Will's trauma with his alcoholic father, pushing him into a chaotic nightlife scene to find happiness reads as just profound carelessness. It's a systemic failure to consider character history. That level of neglect points to incompetence in foundational storytelling, not a calculated commercial plot. A malicious writer would have just denied the arc entirely. An incompetent one tries to fix it and just misses the mark that tragically.
Well, let's consider if external factors played a role in this collapse in the writer's room.
Which brings us to the community theory that's known as Divorce-Gate. The theory suggests the writer's room was fundamentally disrupted. It posits that Ross Duffer's ex-wife, Lee Janiak, who was a known queer advocate and the writer-director of the Fear Street films, was allegedly the driving force behind the strong queer subtext in the earlier seasons. Her supposed departure is theorized to be the reason for the sudden drop in quality.
That's an interesting theory. It suggests the failure was due to the loss of a key creative voice rather than, active malice from the remaining team.
Exactly. If the failure is due to a sudden vacuum of perspective, then the flat endings are just the result of the remaining team struggling to execute material they no longer understood, not because they were actively choosing to deceive. And we have to be careful about taking all external commentary as proof. I mean, the actor's comments about the garbage ending, while compelling, are still subjective. It's one frustrated perspective.
That's a fair point, but I'm not convinced a personnel change fully absolves the remaining creators, because they actively insulted the very audience who supported those storylines. There are credible reports that the Duffer Brothers called the passionate queer audience, the ones who devoted years to this subtext, noise that they needed to block out.
That statement, if it's true, shows profound contempt for their fan base.
It is evidence of malice. It solidifies my case. They intentionally fostered this engagement, drew in this committed, lucrative audience, and then just dismissed them as an irrelevant distraction. The failure wasn't just poor writing. It was the deliberate act of ignoring and insulting the community they had built and solicited for years. They led us on, right up until the last moment, only to tell us we were delusional for believing the very subtext they created. That moves this whole thing from weakness into villainy.
I agree that the contempt in those statements is indefensible, and it certainly gives weight to the argument that the failure was, at least in part, a deliberate rejection. However, the sheer degree of failure across the entire board, the inability to resolve Vecna's lore, the inconsistent characterization of Mike and Elle, the mishandling of Kali, it all suggests that even if they acted with malice toward the queer community, they were fundamentally incapable of writing a satisfying ending for anyone. The failure was universal, rooted in incompetence, even if it was colored by commercial cowardice in those specific queer arcs.
So for me, the failure rests squarely on commercially motivated betrayal. They systematically leveraged queer hope for engagement and profit, and it all culminated in a finale that explicitly erased years of careful build-up.
And I still maintain that the sheer volume of narrative inconsistencies and abandoned plots affecting nearly every single character points to an overarching systemic creative collapse. It was a failure of basic storytelling competence that impacted all the arcs, including the queer ones, which makes the outcome a product of creative weakness, not targeted deception.
Well, regardless of whether the motive was calculated greed or just sheer staggering incompetence, the most valuable response has been the audience taking control of the narrative.
That is the undeniable truth.
when a canon fails its audience this spectacularly. The true creative power, it shifts back to the community. The ultimate legacy of this finale might not be the disappointing final season, but the explosion of creative fan works, fan fiction, art, that provide better, more fulfilling stories. The audience has proven itself more than capable of writing the stories that the source material only hinted at. And there is clearly so much more to unpack from all of this.
If you enjoy this video, please like, share, subscribe and hit the bell to the later update from my channel. Thank you for watching till the end and see you in the next video.